We are now being joined by Dan Perry, who's an international affairs expert, joining us from Tel Aviv. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us here for our episode of Deep Dive. Thank you. My first question to you is, President Trump insists that Tehran is secretly at the table, while Foreign Minister Araghchi calls the very notion of talks an admission of defeat. In a conflict where the supreme leader was assassinated just weeks ago, is it even possible for a formal Iranian hierarchy to negotiate? Or are we witnessing a shadow dialogue where the real terms are being set by military commanders rather than diplomats?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, and I don't think anyone really has an answer. In general, we should avoid taking too seriously public statements in the middle of negotiations that happen in the middle of a war. So it's clear that the statements have their own purpose, which is not necessarily to deliver the truth to the listening public audience. It's reasonable to think that the degree of thrashing that Iran is observing would have created some kind of internal divisions, competing centers of power, disagreements over how to proceed. They no longer have a central authority that is respected by all sides. With the demise of Ali Khamenei, has potentially created some version of chaos in Iran. And we seem to see it in occasionally conflicting statements coming out of Iran. On the other hand, on the U.S. side, you have conflicting statements coming out of Trump himself, seemingly reversing himself, several times per hour at some points, wildly affecting markets in the U.S. and creating speculation that insiders are benefiting from those fluctuations. It's all simply a circus. And I wouldn't be terribly surprised to find that there is a deal that is announced at some point, which probably would leave a lot of things open, but would allow all sides leeway to declare victory, each in their own way. Trump, and for that matter, Israel, can always just say, look, we did so much damage and we eliminated so many bad guys and we scared them so terribly that it's a whole new regime and so we won. They're going to say that. And Iranians are going to say that if the government of Iran continues to label itself the Islamic Republic, then they survived, and by that token, they won as well. I think we simply have to wait and be a little bit humble in our assessments. Do I think Trump could be totally lying? Yeah, there's precedent for that. But I tend to believe that indeed there is a version of dialogue. We see the dialogue, at least indirectly, in the very fact that the U.S. had issued these surrender terms, basically, and Iran has rejected them. There you go, that's a dialogue. Will Iran stick to that rejection? They are playing, they are holding so tight to their positions, despite the fact that they obviously are being militarily overpowered, that one senses a certain suicidal bent on the part of the Islamic Republic. They may be willing to go down with the ship, basically, and draw the U.S. into a prolonged war that will increasingly harm the people of Iran, maybe the infrastructure of the country. They presumably want that. They want to have it start to appear as if the war is against the Iranian people and state and not the Iranian regime. I think we're at a moment that could be an inflection point, but then again, we could be at a plateau that just leads to steady but slow escalation for another month.
And point 5 of Iran's counter-proposal demands formal recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, effectively suggesting it could collect tolls similar to the Suez Canal. Given that 20% of the world's oil flows through this choke point, is Washington's 15-point plan a genuine olive branch, or is the US buildup of Marines and paratroops in the region a signal that the reopening of the Strait is a non-negotiable military objective, regardless of the talk?
Of course, reopening the Strait is a non-negotiable military objective. Iran's blocking of the Strait is completely and totally illegal. Iran's demand that it have sovereignty recognized over The Strait of Hormuz is a total absurdity. No one's going to allow them to collect tolls. They have no sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz does not sit within Iran. They have territorial waters on the north side of it, but any comparison to Suez is absurd because the Suez Canal goes directly through Egyptian territory. Egypt controls all of it. The Strait of Hormuz is between Iran and Oman, and for that matter, further to the west, the UAE. Iran doesn't have that right. No one's going to let them collect tolls. So for Iran to, state that demand is great. I mean, I can also demand sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and try to collect tolls. No one's going to allow me to do so, and no one's going to allow Iran to do so. This amounts to a doubling down and to a continuing bet that they can mess with the world and the world will run out of patience because oil prices and stocks are plummeting and we will eventually go away. That's the bet. I'm not sure they're wrong, but it's brazen, it's courageous, and it's potentially reckless.
And the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaks of a glimmer of hope, but regional analysis fear a Gaza-style protracted conflict in Lebanon and Iran if Beijing and Cairo are pushing for a multi-front ceasefire that includes all resistance groups. Does the US's 15-point plan, which focuses heavily on nuclear rollback and shipping, risk failing by ignoring the very regional proxies that Iran considers its core security architecture?
I believe the U.S. position includes that Iran should cease to fund and train and basically control militias wreaking havoc upon the Arab world. That Iran should view these militias as part of its security infrastructure is another absurdity that should never have been tolerated. And it would seem currently is no longer being tolerated. I don't think that it's inconceivable that the U.S. might agree to do a nuclear deal and forget about those militias, but it's not necessarily so. And many in the Arab world would like whatever results from this war to put an end to Iran's chaos project via Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Shiite militias. In what parallel universe is it okay for a country to undermine the sovereignty of its neighbors and even far away, non-contiguous regional players like Lebanon with militias? It's craziness. Imagine France affecting Poland with militias. So I don't think it'll be accepted. I don't know how Iran can be compelled to cease its behavior if indeed the regime is suicidal, if indeed the regime believes that as long as they can keep causing oil prices to spike and as long as the world is not prepared to pay a price for compelling them to stop, if they really want to continue this way, then the war could last a long time. Or, again, it might not. It's always true that because we have an absurd situation where the U.S. is currently in a somewhat monarchic phase, truly bizarre. Everything is down to Trump. Yeah, who knows? He may really walk away, and then the Iranians, thrashed and battered and beaten, will be able to say that they remain unbowed. And that would be a catastrophe for the Iranian people, primarily.
Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us here for our episode of Deep Dive. Thank you.